April 3, 1985, Redwood Springs, Texas. The pickup truck sat there like a question mark on gravel. Deputy Frank Holloway noticed it first during his dawn patrol. A dusty Ford F-150, engine still running, parked crooked along the abandoned railway line that hadn't seen a train in 15 years. The headlights were still on, dimmed now in the pale morning light. A torn work glove lay on the hood, fingers spread open as if reaching for something. Inside the cab, a half-drunk thermos of coffee sat in the cup holder, still lukewarm to the touch. The owner was Clifford Maynard, a 32-year-old mechanic who ran a small garage on the edge of town. Everyone knew Cliff. He fixed tractors, changed oil, and never charged the widows more than parts cost. He had steady hands, a quiet demeanor, and a reputation for showing up on time. That morning, he didn't show up at all. Frank radioed it in. Sheriff Tom Bridger arrived 20 minutes later, boots crunching on the dry earth. The two men stood in the heat, staring at the truck as if it might explain itself. Cliff's toolbox was open in the truck bed, wrenches scattered like someone had been interrupted mid-task. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away into the brush. Maybe he walked off to take a leak, Frank suggested, squinting toward the mesquite trees. With his truck running, Bridger replied. For 6 hours. They searched the area until noon. The sun climbed high and merciless, turning the landscape into a furnace of red dirt and dry grass. They found nothing, no footprints, no cigarette butts, no clues. By evening, Cliff's wife, Donna, stood in the sheriff's office, her face pale and tight. She was 29, pregnant with their second child, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She told them Cliff had left the house around 4 a.m. to help Ralph Dunbar with a broken hay baler. Ralph owned a large ranch just north of town and often hired Cliff for repairs. He said he'd be back by breakfast, Donna whispered. He promised. The sheriff drove out to the Dunbar ranch that same night. Ralph met him at the gate, a tall man in his mid-30s with sun-damaged skin and forearms thick from years of ranch work. He seemed genuinely surprised. Cliff never showed it, Ralph said, leaning against the fence post. I waited till 6, then figured he got tied up somewhere else. You know how it is. Did you call him? Didn't have his number on me. Figured I'd catch him later in the week. Bridger wrote it down. Everything Ralph said made sense, but something about the way he stood there, too still, too calm, stuck in the sheriff's mind like a burr. The search expanded over the next few days. Volunteers combed the railway line, the dry creek beds, the thickets of juniper and mesquite. They dragged the old stock pond on the Harmon property. They checked abandoned barns, grain silos, and the crumbling remains of the old cotton gin. They found rusted cans, a coyote den, and the skeletal remains of a longhorn steer, but no Clifford Maynard. By the end of April, the case began to cool. The local newspaper ran a story. Mechanic vanishes near old rail line. Family seeks answers. Tips came in. Sightings in El Paso, rumors of gambling debts, whispers about a woman in Abilene. None of them led anywhere. Donna gave birth to a daughter that July. She named her Claire after Cliff's mother. The baby had his dark eyes. The first year was the hardest. Donna stayed in Redwood Springs, hoping Cliff would walk through the door one day with some wild explanation. She kept his garage open for a while, but the bills piled up and the customers drifted to the new Chevron station on the highway. By Christmas of 1986, she'd sold the property and moved back to her parents' place in Lubbock. People talked. In a town of 1-200, everyone had a theory. Some said Cliff had run off to start over. Maybe he'd gotten cold feet about being a father again. Others whispered about debts to the wrong people or an affair that went sideways. A few older folks remembered that Cliff's uncle had disappeared back in the 60s, and they wondered aloud if it ran in the family. Ralph Dunbar's name came up more than once. He'd been the last person to expect Cliff that morning, and some folks thought that was suspicious. But Ralph was well liked, a deacon at First Baptist, and a major employer in the area. Sheriff Bridger questioned him twice more, but Ralph's story never changed. He had no reason to harm Cliff. He barely knew him outside of business. The case went cold by 1987. Bridger retired in 1991, handing the file over to his successor with a note. No leads. Presumed dead or voluntary disappearance. Donna remarried in 1993, a good man who worked for the school district. She stopped coming back to Redwood Springs. Cliff's mother, Evelyn, died in 1998 without ever knowing what happened to her son. His daughter, Claire, grew up barely remembering him, just a faded photograph on the mantel, and stories told in hushed tones. Redwood Springs moved on. The old railway line was torn up in the 2000s and replaced with a gravel bike path. The Dunbar Ranch stayed in the family. Ralph's son took over in 2010, when Ralph's knees gave out. The annual rodeo still drew crowds. The diner still served chicken fried steak on Thursdays, but in certain circles, at the VFW Hall, at the feed store, at the back tables of the Golden Skillet Cafe, people still wondered. Cliff Maynard's name became shorthand for something unfinished, a question that hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight. In 2022, the Texas Cold Case Division launched a new initiative, reopening unsolved disappearances from the 1980s using advanced DNA analysis and digital forensics. A young investigator named Rachel Crowley pulled Cliff's file almost by accident while searching for cases in West Texas. She was 31, sharp-eyed, and stubborn in the way that good investigators are. She read through the yellowed reports, the witness statements, the grainy photographs of the abandoned truck. Something about it bothered her. The truck had been idling for hours. The toolbox was open. The glove was torn. "People don't just vanish," she said to her partner, a veteran investigator named Luis Rocha. "Not like that." "Maybe he did," Luis replied. "It was the 80s. Easier to disappear back then, or easier to get away with murder." Rachel requested the evidence from storage. Most of it had been lost or mishandled over the decades, but a few items remained. The torn glove, a scrap of denim fabric found snagged on barbed wire near the truck, and a small metal button. The denim had never been tested. In 1985, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. Rachel sent it to the lab. March 2025. Redwood Springs, Texas. The results came back on a Tuesday morning. Rachel sat in her cramped office in Austin, staring at the screen. The denim fabric contained 2 DNA profiles. One matched Clifford Maynard's dental records and blood type on file. The other was unknown, but it was male and it was in the system. She ran it through the database. Match: Ralph Eugene Dunbar, Diob, 11/12/1948. Her heart kicked hard in her chest. Ralph Dunbar, the rancher, the man who'd been the last to see Cliff alive, or so he claimed. Rachel called Luis. "We need to go to Redwood Springs." "Why?" "Because I think Ralph Dunbar killed Clifford Maynard." They drove out the next day. The town looked smaller than Rachel had imagined, sun-bleached and quiet, with a single stoplight swaying in the wind. They met with the current sheriff, a soft-spoken woman named Angela Reyes, who listened carefully and pulled the old case file from a dusty archive box. "Ralph's still around," Angela said. "Lives on the ranch. 76 now. Keeps to himself mostly. His son runs the operation." "We'll need a warrant," Rachel said. "For what?" "To search the ranch. If Dunbar's DNA is on fabric found at the scene, it means he lied. He said he never saw Cliff that morning. But he did." The warrant came through 2 days later. At dawn on March 28, 2025, a team of deputies and investigators descended on the Dunbar ranch. Ralph's son, Jacob, met them at the gate, confused and defensive. "What's this about?" "We need to search the property," Rachel said, "in connection with the disappearance of Clifford Maynard in 1985. Jacob's face went pale. "Carson, that was 40 years ago. Cold cases don't have expiration dates." They searched the main house first, neat, sparse, with faded family photos on the walls, then the outbuildings, the machine shed, the old chicken coop. Finally, they reached the barn. It was a massive structure, weathered wood and rusted tin, filled with decades of accumulated junk. Old saddles, broken fencing, coils of barbed wire, and hay bales stacked to the rafters. Rachel walked slowly through the space, her boots echoing on the dirt floor. Luis was up in the hayloft, sifting through boxes. "Rachel," he called down, "you need to see this." She climbed the ladder. Luis was crouched near the far corner, where the floorboards had rotted through. He'd pulled one up. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a revolver. Rachel's breath caught. She pulled on gloves, carefully lifted the bundle. The cloth was brittle, stained dark in places. Inside was a Smith & Wesson .38 Special, the barrel still crusted with old dirt. "Bag it," she said quietly. They kept searching. An hour later, in the main house, Rachel opened the bottom drawer of an old oak desk in Ralph's study. Inside, beneath a stack of faded receipts and cattle auction flyers, was a wristwatch. It was a Timex, scratched and tarnished. On the back, engraved in small letters, C. J. M. 1980. Clifford James Maynard. Rachel held it up to the light, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "We've got him," she said. April 2, 2025, Redwood Springs, Texas. Ralph Dunbar was arrested at 6:47 a.m. as the sun broke over the flat horizon. He didn't resist. He didn't say a word. He just stood there in his faded jeans and plaid shirt, hands behind his back as the cuffs clicked shut. The town erupted. By noon, the parking lot outside the sheriff's office was packed. News vans from Lubbock and Amarillo lined the street. The Golden Skillet Cafe filled with locals debating over coffee and pie. Some couldn't believe it. Ralph Dunbar, the man who sponsored Little League teams and donated to the church. Others nodded grimly as if they'd suspected all along. Donna Maynard, now Donna Fletcher, drove in from Lubbock the next day. She was 59, graying at the temples, but her eyes still carried the weight of 1985. She sat across from Rachel in a small interview room. "Is it really him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We believe so," Rachel said. "The evidence is strong." Donna's hands trembled. Why would he? We're still piecing that together." Rachel had spent the past week working the case non-stop. The revolver had been sent to ballistics. There was no bullet to match it to. Cliff's body had never been found, but the serial number traced back to a gun reported stolen from a ranch supply store in 1982. The denim fabric with Ralph's DNA had been found snagged on barbed wire just 20 feet from where Cliff's truck was abandoned. And then there was the watch. Rachel interviewed Ralph twice. He sat in the interrogation room with a court-appointed lawyer, his face weathered and expressionless. He denied everything. "I didn't kill Cliff Maynard," he said flatly. "I don't know how that watch got in my desk. Someone must have planted it. And the gun. Never seen it before." "Your DNA was on fabric found at the scene." Ralph's jaw tightened. "Maybe I gave him a ride once. Maybe we shook hands. I don't remember. It was 40 years ago." His lawyer leaned in. "Unless you have a body, Sheriff, this is all circumstantial." Rachel knew he was right, but she kept digging. She tracked down the original deputies who'd worked the case. Frank Holloway had died in 2019, but his widow gave Rachel access to his personal files. In a box in her garage, Rachel found Frank's handwritten notes from April 1985, notes that had never made it into the official report. One entry stood out. "Talked to Jimmy Cortez at the feedlot. Says he saw 2 trucks near the rail line around 5 a.m. One was Cliff's Ford, the other looked like Ralph Dunbar's Chevy. Didn't think much of it at the time." Rachel found Jimmy Cortez living in a trailer park outside of town. He was 72 now, his memory fading, but when she showed him the old photos, his eyes sharpened. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I remember that morning. I was hauling hay. I saw Cliff's truck by the tracks, and Ralph's was there too, parked just off the road." "Did you tell anyone?" "I told Frank, but nobody ever followed up." Rachel pressed further. "Did you see anything else?" Jimmy hesitated. "I heard something, a loud crack like a backfire or maybe a gunshot, but it was just the one. I figured it was someone hunting coyotes." "What time?" "Maybe 5:30, right before the sun came up." Rachel thanked him and drove back to the sheriff's office. She pulled the original case file and flipped to the witness statements. Jimmy Cortez's name wasn't there. She called the district attorney. "We need to charge him." "With what? We don't have a body." "We have DNA, we have the gun. We have a witness who puts Ralph at the scene, and we have motive." "What motive?" Rachel had found it buried in old property records. In 1984, Clifford Maynard had filed a lien against Ralph Dunbar for unpaid work. $3,200 in repairs Ralph had refused to pay. The lien was still active in April 1985. "Cliff was going to take him to court," Rachel said. "Ralph couldn't afford to lose that case. He had debts. The ranch was struggling, and Cliff wouldn't back down." The DA was quiet for a long moment. "All right, let's go to trial." May 2025, Redwood Springs Courthouse. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the watch, the gun, and Jimmy Cortez's testimony. The defense argued contamination, coincidence, and reasonable doubt. Ralph Dunbar never took the stand. On the final day, the jury deliberated for 11 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the 2nd degree." The courtroom exhaled. Some people wept. Others sat in stunned silence. Ralph showed no emotion. He was led away in handcuffs, his head high. Outside, Rachel stood on the courthouse steps, the evening sun casting long shadows across the square. Donna Fletcher approached her, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not forgetting him." Rachel nodded. He deserved to be remembered. But as Rachel drove back to Austin that night, she kept thinking about the case file, about the missing page from 1985, the one listing who had first reported the truck. She'd never found it, and when she'd asked Sheriff Reyes about it, Angela had frowned. "That's strange. It should have been there." Rachel pulled over at a gas station and opened her laptop. She cross-referenced the dispatch logs from April 3, 1985. The first call reporting the abandoned truck had come in at 6:14 a.m. The caller's name, Ralph Dunbar. Rachel sat back, her mind racing. Ralph had called it in. He'd reported the truck himself. That meant he'd been there. Not just nearby, but there. And if he'd been there, and Cliff was already gone, she thought about the torn glove on the hood, the toolbox left open, the engine still running. Ralph had staged it. He'd called it in to look innocent, to be the concerned neighbor, the helpful rancher, and for 40 years, it had worked. Rachel closed the laptop and stared out at the darkening highway. Somewhere out in that vast Texas landscape, Clifford Maynard was still missing. His body had never been found. Maybe it never would be. But his name was no longer just a question mark. It was an answer, and Ralph Dunbar would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In Redwood Springs, the old-timers still gathered at the Golden Skillet. They still talked about the case, turning it over like a familiar coin. Some believed Ralph, some didn't. But on quiet mornings, when the wind swept across the old railway line, you could almost hear it, the ghost of an engine idling in the dark, waiting for a man who would never come home. September 2025. Redwood Springs, Texas. The verdict should have been the end. Ralph Dunbar was sentenced to 25 years to life. At 76, it was effectively a death sentence. The courtroom had closed. The news vans had packed up and left. Redwood Springs settled back into its rhythm of Friday night football games and Sunday morning services. But Rachel Crowley couldn't let it go. She sat in her office in Austin on a sweltering September afternoon, the case file spread across her desk. The conviction had been solid. DNA, physical evidence, witness testimony. The jury had believed it. The judge had affirmed it. Ralph Dunbar was guilty. So why did she feel like something was still missing? It was the body. Clifford Maynard's body had never been found. And without it, there was always that sliver of doubt, that whisper in the back of her mind. Ralph had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, stone-faced and silent. He'd never confessed, never led them to remains. Rachel flipped through Frank Holloway's old notes again, the ones she'd found in his widow's garage. Most of it she'd already combed through, but there was one entry she kept coming back to. April 10, 1985, searched Dunbar property with consent. Ralph cooperative, checked main barn, tool shed, south pasture, nothing found. Note, didn't check old cistern. Ralph said it was sealed in 82 after a calf fell in. Rachel sat up straighter. The old cistern. They'd never searched it during the recent investigation because it hadn't been mentioned in the official reports. Only in Frank's personal notes, she called Sheriff Angela Reyes. "The cistern on the Dunbar ranch," Rachel said. "You know anything about it?" Angela was quiet for a moment. "Old well system, I think. Out past the north pasture." "Why?" Frank Holloway's notes say Ralph told him it was sealed in 1982, 3 years before Cliff disappeared. So why would Ralph specifically mention it if it was already sealed? Why bring it up at all? Angela's voice sharpened. I think we need to look at it." 2 days later, Rachel drove back to Redwood Springs. This time she brought a cadaver dog handler named Marcus Webb and his German shepherd, Sadie. Sheriff Reyes met them at the edge of the Dunbar property with a county engineer named Paul Vasquez. Jacob Dunbar, Ralph's son, stood by the gate with his arms crossed. His face was drawn, exhausted. The trial had aged him. "What now?" he asked bitterly. "We need to search the old cistern," Rachel said. Jacob's expression flickered, something between surprise and resignation. "That thing's been sealed for decades. We still need to check." He led them across the property, past the main barn and the corrals, out to where the land turned wild with mesquite and prickly pear. The cistern sat in a shallow depression, barely visible beneath overgrown grass, and a rusted metal cover bolted down with concrete. Sadie circled the area immediately, her nose working the ground. Then she sat down next to the cistern cover and barked once. Marcus looked at Rachel. "She's got something." Paul Vasquez knelt down, examining the concrete seal. "This is old work," he said, "but it's been disturbed. See these cracks? This wasn't done professionally. Looks like someone mixed concrete by hand and poured it fast." Rachel's pulse quickened. "Can you open it?" It took 2 hours. They brought in equipment, jackhammers, pry bars. The concrete crumbled away in chunks, revealing the old bolts underneath, rusted but still holding. When they finally pulled the metal cover free, a wave of stale, earthy air rushed out. Rachel aimed her flashlight down into the darkness. The cistern was maybe 15 feet deep, stone-lined and narrow. The bottom was littered with debris, rotted wood, old fence posts, a tangle of wire. And then, half buried in the dirt and sediment, she saw it. Bones. "We've got remains," Rachel said quietly. Sheriff Reyes called in the medical examiner and a forensic recovery team. They spent the rest of the day carefully excavating the cistern, photographing every layer, documenting every find. By nightfall, they had recovered a nearly complete human skeleton, along with fragments of clothing, denim, work boots, a belt buckle, and near the skull lodged in the vertebrae, they found a deformed .38 caliber bullet. The medical examiner, Dr. Helen Park, examined the remains on site. Male, early 30s, approximately 5'10", gunshot wound to the upper back, likely severed the spinal cord. Death would have been quick. Rachel looked at the bones laid out on the tarp, illuminated by portable floodlights. After 40 years, Clifford Maynard had finally come home. October 2025, Redwood Springs. The DNA confirmation came back a week later. The remains were positively identified as Clifford James Maynard. The bullet matched the rifling pattern of the revolver found in Ralph's barn. Rachel drove to the state prison in Huntsville to confront Ralph one last time. He was thinner now, grayer, his hands trembling slightly as he sat down across from her in the visiting room. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like someone's grandfather. "We found him," Rachel said, "in the cistern, right where you put him." Ralph stared at her, his face unreadable. "The bullet matches your gun. His DNA is all over that site." "It's over, Ralph. No more lies." For a long moment, Ralph said nothing. Then he let out a slow, shuddering breath. "I didn't mean to," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean for any of it." Rachel leaned forward. "Tell me what happened." Ralph closed his eyes. "Cliff came to the ranch that morning, early, like we'd planned. But he didn't come to fix the baler. He came to collect the lien. Yeah, he had the paperwork. Said he was filing it with the court that afternoon if I didn't pay up. $3,000. Ralph's hands clenched into fists. I didn't have it. The ranch was bleeding money. Drought, bad cattle prices, loans I couldn't cover. I begged him to wait. Just a few more months. And he said no. Ralph nodded. He said I'd had a year, that he had a family to feed too, that he wasn't running a charity. His voice cracked. We argued. Out by the barn, I told him he was going to ruin me. He said that wasn't his problem. Rachel waited. I had the gun in my truck. I'd been using it for coyotes. I don't even remember pulling it out. I wanted him to listen. To stop walking away. Ralph's eyes opened, wet and red. He turned around, started yelling at me, told me to grow up and pay my debts like a man. "So you shot him?" "I didn't mean to. My hand it just went off. One shot." He dropped like a stone. Ralph's voice was barely a whisper now. There was so much blood. He tried to say something, but then he just stopped. Rachel's jaw tightened. "What did you do?" I panicked. I drove his truck to the rail line, made it look like he'd been there, left his toolbox open, tore his glove. Then I went back and I put him in the cistern. It took me all day to seal it. I told everyone it had been sealed for years. Nobody questioned it. "And you called it in," played the concerned neighbor. Ralph nodded miserably. "I thought if I was the one who reported it, nobody would suspect me. And for 40 years, it worked." Rachel stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Clifford Maynard had a wife, a daughter, a mother who died without knowing what happened to him. You took all of that from them. "I know," Ralph whispered. "I know." Rachel walked out without another word. November 2025, Redwood Springs Cemetery. The funeral was small. Donna Fletcher stood at the graveside, her daughter Claire beside her. Claire was 40 now, a schoolteacher in Lubbock, with her father's dark eyes and quiet demeanor. She'd never really known him, but she'd carried his absence her entire life. They buried Clifford's remains next to his mother's grave, under a simple headstone that read, Clifford James Maynard, 1953, 1985, beloved husband, father, and friend, gone but not forgotten. Rachel attended the service, standing at the back with Sheriff Reyes. The sky was overcast, the November wind sharp and cold. When the service ended, Donna approached them. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now, "for bringing him home." "I'm sorry it took so long," Rachel replied. Donna shook her head. "You gave us something we never thought we'd have. Closure. Peace." She looked back at the grave. "Now we can finally say goodbye." Claire stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. "These were my dad's tools," she said. "Sang from his garage. I've kept them all these years." She knelt down and placed the box at the base of the headstone. "I thought he should have them back." Rachel felt something tighten in her chest. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As the mourners dispersed, Rachel walked back to her car. The case was closed now, truly closed. Ralph Dunbar's appeal had been denied. He would die in prison. Clifford Maynard's body had been found, identified, and laid to rest with dignity. Justice, as imperfect as it was, had been served. But as Rachel drove out of Redwood Springs for the last time, she thought about all the years that had been stolen, the birthdays Cliff had missed, the grandchildren he'd never meet, the life that had been cut short over $3,000, and a man's wounded pride. She thought about the cistern, sealed and forgotten for 40 years, about the silence that had covered this town like dust. And she thought about all the other cases, still waiting in boxes and filing cabinets across Texas, the other families still searching, the other stories still buried. She pulled out her phone and called Luis. "I need you to pull the files on unsolved disappearances from 1980 to 1990, she said. "West Texas region. Let's see what else we can dig up." Luis chuckled. "Says you ever take a break?" "Not when there's work to do." Rachel hung up and kept driving, the flat Texas landscape stretching endlessly before her. Somewhere out there, in the small towns and forgotten corners, there were more secrets waiting to surface, more voices waiting to be heard, and she would find them one case at a time.